And yeah, so I will go ahead and introduce our speaker for tonight. Claire Evans is a former journalist, attorney, and college lecturer who started her love of most things British as she and her mother watched countless episodes of Are You Being Served, Fawlty Towers, and The Vicar of Dibley on PBS. She went on to study abroad in London, and against the odds, she married a Brit she met in Peoria, Illinois. They moved to England, where they lived for a number of years. Outside of her work for a legal advice charity, Claire became a student of historical sites, pub dining, and tea shops. Her business, Tea with Claire, grew from friends asking for travel and relocation advice. And with that, Claire will be speaking to us tonight about Mary Anning. So without further ado, Claire, take it away.
Thanks so much. And thanks for joining me this evening. As you may have guessed, I join you from Peoria, Illinois, but I didn't always live here. So just a little background on top of what you heard. My husband works for Caterpillar, and he is a Brit, and just so happened that after I met him here, they wanted him back. And 6 months after we got married, we moved to England, and I probably lived about 4 years on and off, back and forth in various stints. But I basically recycle the best of my highlight reels from when I was living there into talks. I'm a bit of an academic magpie, so is my husband. We read a lot and we enjoy history, and this particular topic, how timely that you happen to be here on Women's History Day. So we actually are completely official. We're on the day. So but I also like this talk in particular because I get to wear my ammonite jewelry. Wink, wink. I love it. So I've collected it from all over, but the Mary Anning's hometown is the home of my bracelet too. Let me show you ammonite. Let me get a good picture of it. There we go. So if I can hold perfectly still, that is ammonite. Ammonite is a fossil, and it is from the Jurassic era. It is particularly what the little town where Mary Anning is from is known for. And I'll show you more pictures of that. But it just so happens that I found a nice piece in Lyme Regis, her little town. I think I found this locally, and I'm not sure where my earrings came from, but hey, it's an excuse, so I wear it. So without a lot more of me chatting, let me explain tonight's topic, Mary Anning. I knew nothing about Mary Anning in the get-go, so I've acquired all sorts of knowledge since, but I'm pretty into all things fossil. I find them really interesting. And so naturally, it just so happened that in the city where I was living in England, it's called Peterborough. It's about 70 miles due north of London. I was at the mall, and I happened to, I suppose, do too much navel gazing, maybe too much staring at the floor. And I noticed that this beautiful shopping center floor is made of polished limestone. Well, within the limestone, there's fossils on the floor of a mall. And I found that outrageous and terribly interesting. So I decided that I thought that warranted more investigation. So the one that you can see that it has that spiral shape, that's an ammonite in the lower right-hand corner. And then in the upper left-hand corner, that's a fossil called a belemnite. And that they're both Jurassic era. Or I should say period, actually. I'll explain. So I wanted to know more. And I'm thinking, as I'm looking around where to visit in the UK as we're living there, that we don't live, something on the sea is always nice. There's something called the Jurassic Coast. And I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. So most people know of Jurassic, the term, in the context of Jurassic Park, the films. But specifically, if you want to know really what is the Jurassic, it's a period of time, and it's within an era. So this spiral that you see, that the more it comes towards us, the nearer in time it is to our modern age. You can see man there at the very tip on the bottom, but then working backward, the red part, it says Rocks of the World Heritage Site. This is the Jurassic Coast. You have everything from the Triassic period, and that goes back to 250 million BC to 200 million BC, 50 million years in there. And then there's the Jurassic. That is the period we'll talk about most tonight. that Mary Anning was finding a lot of things from Jurassic, and that's from 200 million BC to 140 million. And the nearest in time out of the Mesozoic era is the Cretaceous. The Cretaceous is 140 million BC to 65 million BC. And it has a lot of the dinosaurs that we were taught as children. Um, but that isn't to say that we haven't heard of some of the things that are in Jurassic either, that we'll talk about later. So specifically, I had to know, well, where is this place? And it's on the south coast of England. It is 95 miles tip to tip, and it starts in a little town called Exmouth. And literally, that is the mouth of the River Exe. I was kind of flabbergasted when I moved to England. I found out that the language is full of towns that end in muth. And very likely that they're referring to a river that, for example, Plymouth is the mouth of the River Plym. Um, Dartmouth is the mouth of the River Dart, and so on. So it extends east to a very near a little town on the coast called Swanage. And yes, the king's swans were kept there. You can still see swans in Swanage. It is what it says on the tin, as the Brits would say. It's not false advertising. So back in 2001, this stretch of coastline became a UNESCO World Heritage Site. They apply to the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization for recognition as a worldwide historically and culturally significant spot, and they were accepted. So I thought, well, this all bodes well. Tell me more. When I saw pictures of it, it certainly is quite attractive. This is one of the most photographed spots on the Jurassic Coast. This is a natural rock arch called the Durdle Door. And you can see it's just kind of toward the eastern bit there. It's a little bit eastern of where we'll be talking about. The majority of what I'm going to talk to you about this evening happened in a tiny town, home of Mary Anning, called Lyme Regis. Lyme Regis is particularly rich in ammonites, as I just showed you. In fact, the unofficial town symbol is the ammonite. They've even incorporated them into the streetlights. You can see the swirls of the wrought iron in the lights, even on just city streets. So allegedly, if you are a fossil dealer in the UK, this town, this tiny little place, is the best best venue to make a living, simply because of the draw of people that go to it in search of fossils. You can pick up stuff off the beach. It is not a crime. It's not verboten at all. You can just have it. So that's a lot of the allure, especially if you have children who are interested in scavenging. I was interested in scavenging, so I thought, well, sold. Tell me more. Let's go. So we did, and from what I found out, this is a map actually of the bus line. They have a little coast hopper, they call it, and it shows really nicely from the colors orange and blue and green that there towards the south, it starts in orange. That's the Triassic period of fossils that are along the coast. And then right by a town, interestingly enough, named Beer, it's true, it's Beer, Beer. Then it converts over to Cretaceous for just a little bit. Then it picks up Triassic again in orange, and then up by Lyme Regis, is Jurassic period. It is very unusual to have fossils from 3 separate eras in one geographical place. So Lyme Regis, the little town you see in the box there, it kind of straddles. It's not exactly in both, but it's on the border of 2 counties in England. Devon is the county that goes west, and Dorset is the one that goes east. Its little nickname is called the Pearl of Dorset. So it's been a seaside resort for a very, very long time. It's quite central on that coast. And so far as long times go, the Royal Charter, it was officially started in 1284 under the reign of, that was King Edward I. So it got to be known as a seaport that was important for limestone quarrying and shipbuilding. Part of why that was possible is this man-made small artificial harbor and a breakwater. It was built in the 13th century. Gosh, 1200, that's super old. It's called the Cobb, C-O-B-B. And that is why Lyme Regis was able to rise as prominence as this major seaport and shipbuilding center. In fact, in 1780, it was larger than Liverpool. And Liverpool is a very sizable shipping city in the north of England on the west coast. If you've read a book named or called The French Lieutenant's Woman, or you've seen that film, it was inspired by the book, had Meryl Streep in it, made in the early 80s. This landmark features heavily, and it's also mentioned in one of Jane Austen's books, Persuasion. There's an accident on the Cobb. It's actually kind of perilous. You can't readily see that. This is my vacation picture. You can't readily see the tilt of this. It's tilted in the second level so that seawater can run off during storms. But remarkably enough, when I was there and in a lot of pictures, this part of the coast, unless there's churning storms or something, is really small, really calm seas. It's quite glassy. I'd never seen the ocean so calm as it was when we were visiting. So it just so happened that I kind of got a bit of good luck. And when we were there, I found a place to stay. And it wasn't the whole building. This is called One Coram Tower, but they have split it up into vacation flats, really. Every floor basically is a different flat. And it was really centrally located to the little village of Lyme Regis. It's in Lyme Regis. The geography of the area, it's quite high up. When you drive there, you drive along a semi-coastal road. It's far enough you can't see the sea, but then the little roads to drop down to the sea towns are really steep, actually. So it's a good hike in this little town. There's some good hills. It's true of all of England, really. So this in particular was built by a man named Thomas Coram. And I didn't know we'd be staying in a historically significant building. He was known for being a local man made good. He made a vast fortune, but he did it in Boston, of all places. He was a shipbuilder there. And once he had earned enough money there to be independently wealthy, he returned to his native England. And his special cause was orphans. So he is best known perhaps for founding the Foundlings Hospital for children in London. And that's a orphanage hospital for kids that are dropped that their parents cannot care for them. Pretty sad, but this in particular was built as housing for teachers that served a orphanage and orphan school in Lyme Regis. So from there, it was super easy to wander into the middle of the little village. And there we saw a life-size, I suppose it's not a poster, it's a cardboard cutout of Mary Anning. I didn't know who this lady was, but thankfully there is a very round blue badge on the side of the building, as is typical with many historically significant buildings in the UK. They'll have that blue medallion on them, and it'll explain, well, what are these places? So it said Mary Anning, her date 1799 to 1847. They believed that the site of the Lyme Regis Museum, that building, was at one point her home and fossil shop until about 1826. And Mary is saying, we're open. So of course I had to go in, and I was beckoned to go in by what I saw, and my feet talk about interesting. Now, if I like the mall's floor, imagine how I felt about this. Ammonites galore. Too bad I couldn't chisel them up, but no. It's fine because I got my fair share later on. So here's what I learned. This museum is really dedicated to her in some part. There's a lot going on from a paleontological point of view in Lyme Regis, and she factors heavily. So she has a rather fascinating story. However, here are the themes. She is unsung. She had a lot of sadness in her life, actually, and she lived a very roller coaster sort of hand-to-mouth existence, which is rather surprising and sad considering the magnitude of the contribution she made to science. So here she is. There is relatively little written in contemporaneous sources about her because she was very simple. She came from very modest means, and she was born into poverty. She died in poverty. She wrote and she could read and write beautifully, but she didn't have a lot of time to do that, frankly. She was out looking for fossils. This is how she made her living. So we do have some, there's just not a huge amount about her, and there's only 2 known pictures, one of which you see. This was a portrait done of oil painting of her attributed to Robert Gray. And they think it was her about, I think it's about 1842. So that exists. And then thereafter, this was made into a pastel. And you can see these. This one in particular you see is held by the Natural History Museum in the UK. But there's just not a lot to go on with her. So we have what we have. But I'll tell you about what there is. The little dog is her dog Trey, by the way. So yeah, she is she's known now in people that are kind of finding out about her as a giant. She's been known for a long time within the science community as a giant of paleontology and geology, and considered the greatest fossilist the world ever knew. That's saying something. A fossilist is someone who makes it their business to go seek and find and clean and sell, sometimes fossils. So she's largely uncredited for a lot of the works that are directly attributable to her, especially within her lifetime. She was practically, she was very seldom credited. There are a few instances. Largely, the people who bought from her are credited, or those who curators of museums where her finds wound up are credited by the scientific community, but not her. Why is this? Well, she was the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that by that I mean she was female in a heavily male-dominated society that catered to wealthy men. Actually, she was in the right place. She certainly had access to all sorts so I revised that statement. If for what she did, she was in exactly the right place in the world. It just didn't work out that being female in that time frame was beneficial for her career, put it that way. So, though, what she wound up finding in her lifetime, many things that had never been discovered before, are what formed the backbone and led directly to the writing of Darwin's 1859 on the origin of the species, which is considered the seminal work and the foundation of evolutionary biology. Had we not had Mary Anning's findings, or at least Darwin would not have been familiar with them, he couldn't have written that. So she died early, not too terribly early by that time, actually. It depends. The lifespan is not great in her era. At 47, she never married. Well, how did she begin? She's the daughter of Molly and Richard Anning. He was a cabinet maker. He was a fossilist too. In fact, he took her out on the beaches and trained her as to what he would look for and how to clean it, and they sold it for money. And he was also known as a rabble rouser, and that is primarily because he led a riot, actually, in his youth. It protested the cost of bread during the Napoleonic Wars. That was the wars that Napoleon was perpetuating on behalf of France were churning up, shall we say, causing turmoil in Europe. And there was no trade back and forth between the continent and the UK as well. The cost of bread was made artificially high, and that for working class people was a horrible burden because they need bread to live. So that was kind of a rough start there, but she had an older brother, Joseph. He and she were one of 10 children born to this couple. They were the only two to survive to adulthood. As I said, her dad trained her to go hunting on the beach for fossils, which was not very ladylike. It was very dangerous. And I'll show you some of the geology of the area that made that true. And then importantly, also, she learned from him how to clean these fossils, because that's not exactly an easy task either. And they sold them. In fact, she and her dad would sit at the bottom of the coach line that came down from London, because Lyme Regis is a fashionable little seaside resort. And amongst the people that were very well off, they would sell these, they called them curiosities, little fossilized tokens of their trip, souvenirs. So Georgian times would have been the reign of the four Georges, about roughly 1730 to 1830-ish. But in her time in particular, during her lifetime, people were collecting these and they put them in their curio cabinets. So just as a note, though, how rare is it that she was one of two to survive, or sorry, she was 2 of 10 to survive her family as a child. it was very difficult to live if you were under 5 in her era. The closest in time statistics to when she was alive were census data from 1841. And it showed that about 329 of every 1,000 children didn't survive in the UK until their 5th birthday, third mortality. And the funny thing is, though, if those children were able to make it to an older birthday, so the first graph, you see a lot of this nowadays, steep charts, but I'll boil it down. So when you're born, if you were a male in 1841, your average lifespan was 40.2 years. That takes into account the first 5 years of your life, which are really dangerous. But if you were able, that same male, to make it until age 30, then miraculously your lifespan increases to 63.1 years. So it's childhood that's super dangerous. In fact, the oldest standing child, also named Mary, died in a very sad way. When she was a tiny girl, 3, she had been trained to put wood shavings from her dad's cabinetry into the fire, and her mother left her for just a second while she did this, and she caught fire and she died of her burns. So then they went on to name another child Mary, the one that lived too. Well, another fate could have befallen her quite early, death. She was struck by lightning at age 1. She was just a bit over a year old, and she was with a group of young women, one of whom was babysitting her. And they were at a local horse show. It was like a county fair. Very unusual for the UK to have an electrical storm, especially with the violence that North Americans can experience thunderstorms with. This doesn't happen. It really makes them upset. Can sometimes fascinating, but rather dangerous. They don't really know what to do. So this group of young women she's with, she's taken to shelter under a tree, and the tree is struck by lightning. Every single one of that group died except Mary. They were able to revive her by putting her in warm water. But oddly enough, her mother noted that before her lightning strike, she was a dull child. And then afterward, they described her as lively and intelligent. So some historians have posited a theory that she was a savant, because there is historical precedent for people who have been struck by lightning to develop out of the ordinary skills. It has happened and has been recorded. But one of the exceptional savant abilities is to recognize, to have really exceptional spatial recognition, things in 3D. This fits with what she was to later go on to do, because her line of work would have absolutely required her to have that sort of really, really first-rate stellar 3D recognition. And to be able to find what she found, you would have to have, the people that were coming down from academia didn't see what she saw. After years of training, and maybe she just had this knack. She may well have been a savant. So it's unknown, but it's a theory. Jane Austen intersects her life a little bit. Just as a bit of background, in 1758, visitors from the very lovely spa town of Bath, that would have been Jane Austen's old stomping grounds, they could use a new road to get into Lyme Regis because it was being cut to the shore, because they were originating staycations later on during the Napoleonic Wars, because all of the ports of Europe were closed to the wealthy. They couldn't go to the continent. So they needed to staycation in their own backyard. So that was how this Lyme Regis really got established as a seaside resort. It was on the heels of the Napoleonic War. Jane Austen came in the same time period, 1804. And now she has a very much a treasure trove of letters written by her to her. She's a writer. And there's an incident recorded in a letter she wrote to her sister Cassandra, where she requests a quote on a broken cabinet she owns from Richard Anning, Mary's dad. And the quote she received was worth 5 shillings. His price would have been worth about $100 in 2020 money. And she remarked in her tongue-in-cheek way that she thought the entire room of her furniture was worth $100. So she took her business elsewhere. But it's kind of funny that they lived at the same time. They do overlap a little bit. Mary's family was among a group called dissenters. This made her life extra difficult. They were not members of the Church of England. So the Church of England is the establishment church, they Anglicans. In fact, though, if you were a dissenter, not a member of this church, it would have been illegal until 1689. But then thereafter, it really hampered your development personally. You couldn't, you were barred from the army, any official positions. Now, if you were a female, this was automatic anyway. Attending university, certain professions you couldn't enter if you were a dissenter. But the good thing that came out of her dissentership is that starting at age 8, she was taught to read and write at the local Sunday school. And there's an interesting volume that her brother gave her that is from the Dissenters Church that showed one article urging their membership to adhere to the story that God made the world in 6 days. And remember, he did certain things, certain tasks on certain days. And then the other article in this volume was talking about the dissenters should take up the new science of geology. Well, they are doomed to collide because shortly, geology, in particular on the back of what Mary Anning did, geology is going to fly in the face of what the church has taught. Everything was not made at the same time. There's an evolutionary process going on. That's at least what the science will support. So people got confused. It produced a lot of anxiety as time went on. Her old church still stands. You can see it in Lyme Regis. In fact, it's what they call grade 1 listed. That's a very historically significant building. It's kind of like it's on the National Register of Historic Places. But it is home to a private museum called Dinosaur Land, go figure. And something else still standing is the poorhouse in Lyme Regis. It's currently shops, but in her day, they very narrowly avoided it. And that's because her father passed away when she was young. She was only 11. He died in 1810, and he had tuberculosis caused by injuring his back and being out of work for 2 years for having been on the cliffs and gathering fossils. It's very dangerous. There's rock slips at any moment. So her brother's 14, she's 11, her mom's expecting child 10. Unfortunately, child 10 doesn't make it. And her dad was the major breadwinner, as the fathers of households were usually in this time. And he left them 120 pounds of debt, which is about 14,000 in today's money. When you consider that the average family in this era was only earning 20 pounds a year, that's 6 years of wages for them. And people have asked why. Well, gosh, how did they owe this much money? One theory is that Richard, the dad, speculated on land and it didn't turn out well for him. The other problem is that in this era, death did not extinguish debt. So if he owed a debt, he dies, even personally, if he contracted it before she was married, he owes a debt. It passes along to his family. So his wife and his widow and his 2 kids are burdened with it. So many people had no choice but to go into the workhouse. Children got separated from their parents, and they were often enrolled in apprenticeships without their consent. It wasn't a good place to be. It was like indentured servitude. So instead, Molly Anning asked for what they call parish alms, a parish relief. It is relief for the poor. It's a giving offering that local churches would give to poor people instead of going into these workhouses. Well, allegedly, it said on the day of her dad's funeral, her mind is made up. That kind of formed the basis of her further life. And that was, she was out fossil hunting after a storm, the best time to fossil hunt because all of the dramatic winds and water churns up a new layer that hasn't been revealed yet. Mary found a beautiful ammonite in limestone in a nodule, which is typical of where it occurs. And an upper-class tourist woman found her on the beach with it, offered her a half crown. So that's what a half crown looks like on the screen. I couldn't find one exactly to align with the time that her father died, but this is only 5 years removed, so it would have looked like this. It was worth a ton of money. In modern times, it's worth about $150. It would have been, in her time, a week's groceries for her family. So it clicked with her. Not only does she enjoy fossil hunting, she's able to help her family financially. So she made up her mind that she would continue to fossil hunt and for this purpose. It's just, she had the eye, she had the talent, and it helped support her family. Well, why was this land where she was so rich in fossils? One of the landmarks where she was. Between Lyme Regis's beach and the next town over's beach called Charmouth Beach, there is a land feature, a cliff called Black Fen. And Black Fen is highly unstable. However, it's really rich in fossils. It's 430 feet up in the air, but it contains a layer of what they call blue lias. Blue lias is a particular type of, it's a formation. And it isn't necessarily on the coast always. It's a ribbon, and it goes throughout England, but it is really rich in fossils. And why it's so rich in particular in this part is because it meets the sea. So when the blue lias rich layer of fossils collides with the sea, it erodes, and there's always something new revealed. So it's a lot more opportunity. However, it's super dangerous because the top layer is limestone. During bad rains, the limestone layer is porous, and underneath is clay. And that clay becomes super slippery, and they literally call it a landslip when you get these big landfalls. So you really have to know what you're doing and be always on the lookout for what's ahead of you. We took a wonderful tour. We went fossil hunting with a geologist from the Lyme Regis Museum. And he would tell us all this stuff too. But the other thing is to know the tide schedule, because a lot of beaches in England are covered. When it's high tide, you lose the beach. So unless you want to go up the unstable cliffs, you'd be well advised to know when the tide comes in and out. So question, what was she looking for? What was she bound to find? I talked to you a little bit about ammonites. So what are they? They are most closely related to modern, they're extinct marine mollusks that are related to octopus, squid, cuttlefish. Sometimes they say they're related to nautilus. I think the paleontologists differ a little bit on that, but I can see why. It's the spiral shape of the shell. They went extinct 66 million years ago. All that she's going to find are warm water fossils. They were marine habitated creatures that occur in warm water. Sometimes, though, they would attach superstitions because they couldn't explain what are they finding. They'd call them snake stones. They'd carve the heads of these things with snake heads, and they'd keep them in their pocket as charms. Well, when we were on our fossil walk, I will show you for just a second. My husband was the one, he got very lucky, and he found, and as I said, you can just pick these up. That is an ammonite. And in particular, when you look at it, there's all sorts of ammonites embedded in different sorts of rock and fossilized in lots of different ways. This is a particularly good way to be fossilized because it's iron pyrite. In life, this looks like brass. It's very kind of golden shiny, and the detail of the fossil is very beautifully preserved, and depends on what sort of how it fell and where it was and what sort of minerals took over the fossil to see what sort of detail there was. That one has a number of them, and a bigger one is on the corner. There's that one by my finger. And then once in a while, we would just be walking, and he found a teeny tiny one. So these are iron pyrite. Now, the ones that are in my jewelry have been mineralized, fossilized, just in a different way with a different chemical composition. So that's why they look different. So there was that. And then there was something else. There's actually quite a few other things. Mary can look for something called graphea. And they always have a fun little nickname, devil's toenails. They are an extinct relative of modern oysters, and they're little things. I'll show you in a second, but they're really fairly common in lower Jurassic limestone, which is where this Lyme Regis is full of it. So if you carried one, they would superstitiously believe that would prevent rheumatism. But they are a little more rare than ammonites, but we were lucky enough to get one, I think with the help of the geologist. So you can see mine is not perfect. There we go. It's kind of been eroded by time and tide for sure, because you can see the inside of it right there is packed with silt. But the outside has been a bit eroded by the ocean, but you can kind of see that hooky sort of shape, the claw And that's the source of the nickname Devil's Toenail. So we were happy that we found one at all. We wouldn't have expected to, because as I said, they're a little bit more scarce than ammonites for sure. So there's those. And then further on, if you were really lucky, you might happen into, the locals call them vertebrae of either, usually in their case, it was going to be ichthyosaur or plesiosaur. Some were fused, you can see in the picture, but so they are common-ish, but they're we're kind of going down the scale of scarcity, more scarce as we go. But people go hunt these in particular in the winter for everything, really, as I said, because that's the most chance you have of churning storms that would take you or to bring you new finds, really. So we have one, we found one. However, ours is quite well eroded, put it that way. It's little. This is probably the shape of a dime, I would say, with an exception. The bottom is leveled off. You can see how it's flat and it's very thin because it's been eroded. However, I can tell you, I can feel with my finger in the top, there's an indentation that was typical of vertebra. So that's kind of, if you wonder a little bit about how to identify this stuff, oh, we needed that geologist. It's quite hard to just know what to look for unless you have a trained eye start to point these out to you. So you can see those divots kind of in the middle of the vertebra. Well, time moved on, and it wasn't too long. They were still children when they discovered the first ichthyosaur. So Joseph, older brother, discovered the skull of an ichthyosaur in 1811. So Mary went on, this was wintertime, so they couldn't quite get on the beach, would be due to weather as quickly as they'd wanted. So it was Mary, though, that discovered the rest of the skeleton. A complete skeleton is a big deal. It's rare. So she discovered that in early 1812, and she was the one that arranged for excavation and the cleaning of the fossils. So she's credited with discovering the first ichthyosaur, but in reality, people had been finding bits of them around this area for years. But this is the first specimen that caught the attention of the London scientific community. In particular, the Geological Society of London began in 1807. They would not admit women until 1919, but one of the names of the founders, Dr. James Parkinson, was quite prominent in medical circles as a Parkinson's disease. That's his namesake. So back on the lizard, it was, well, not a lizard. It was known as a fish lizard. And ichthyosaur translates as that. It kind of looks like a bit of a savage dolphin, a bit. As I said, so she was the one that found the rest of the body. He found the skull. She found the body was 17 foot long. She hired help to get it out. The locals thought she'd found a crocodile. But just to tell you, 17 feet long of a body encased in limestone, comparatively speaking, a 6-foot ichthyosaur in limestone weighs as much as 20 tons. 6 foot. So 20, 40, 60, perhaps 60 tons that she had to hire unearthed. And luckily, she's in a town that does quarrying. So there were stonecutters that were on the scene to be able to do this. Stone industry was prevalent in her time for London stucco buildings, has a lot of the beautiful limestone that came out of Lyme Regis, and ship's ballast too, just to keep ships from properly balanced. As I said, they got a lot of attention out of this one, and they sold it to a nearby lord of the manor. His name was Henry Henley, 23 pounds. That would have been worth about, let's see, 6 months' wages in that sort of period. But sadly enough, this happened all the time. He turned around and resold it in a few years to the British Museum for 45 pounds. So one could argue that profit really rightly would have been hers, or she should have been able to connect with the museum to begin with. But she's just a poor girl. So she takes what she can get, and they live hand to mouth, and 6 months worth of income is no small thing. But later, this is a theme. The scientists who speak about this specimen thank the museums for cleaning and preparing it, not Mary. Think of the work to pull that 20 or nearly 20 tons out of a cliff. Well, this is alarming, not necessarily to the common population yet. It was just interesting to them, and they kind of dismissed it as crocodilian. crocodiles. But anatomists, people in science, are stumped because they know better. They hadn't seen one before. They knew they hadn't. And this is flying in the face of religion. It's the doctrine of the time, the Christianity that's generally adhered to says every being is designed at the same time with a specific purpose. And if you haven't seen it before, one of two things could have happened. Either nothing has ever gone extinct, it's just from a faraway place you haven't seen before, or it got deposited in your spot during the flood while Noah was on the ark. That was the explanation. But in fact, some even went so far as to believe the Anglican bishop, that's named James Ussher, he was Archbishop of Armagh. In 1650, he claimed he'd done great research to prove that the world began in 4004 BC. Well, we know it goes back for millions and hundreds of millions of years before that. So on the scene at the time was a man, my French is awful, Georges Cuvier. He is a very esteemed, well-known anatomist, comparative anatomist. So you bring him something that you don't know what it is, and he will take knowledge of the time and use it to apply to figuring out what you've got. And he was the one that actually introduced the whole concept of something extinct in a lecture in 1796. He's in France. This is controversial, but it goes down a lot better there than it would have in the UK, in England, simply because they're not so tied to their religious beliefs. But he was largely regarded as the greatest intellectual mind in Europe, and certainly the era's finest anatomist. So people consult him frequently. They consider him the founding father of paleontology. So he becomes important later. And then somebody else who's very important in her life in the benevolent column is a lady named Elizabeth Philpott. So she is older than Mary by quite a bit, 1780. So she's nearly 20 years older. She came to Lyme Regis in 1805 with her sisters. She was basically, the Brits would say, turfed out of her house in London. She's a spinster, so are her sisters. Her brother, a solicitor or lawyer, has gotten married and has a new wife, and he wants the London house for him and his wife, and he wants the sisters gone. So he relocates them to a delightful seaside cottage in Lyme Regis, which is a resort town, so he hopes they would be happy there. They never marry. She befriends Mary as she's a child, and she's kind and very supportive to her all her life. She has money, so she can afford to buy books that are on the top topics of paleontology, and Mary gets access to these, so she can be self-taught with the state-of-the-art material. Elizabeth Philpott was a fossilized fish devotee. She had a huge fossil collection. It ultimately went to Oxford, the Oxford Museum. But she did something remarkable. Mary showed her a fossil called belemnite, and I'll show you in a bit in the next slide what exactly is it. But it's a form of squid, and if you're lucky, you might get the ink sac petrified. And it is possible, Elizabeth Philpott proved, to draw that ink petrified out of the fossil and draw with it, revivify it, reconstitute it, and draw. And that's what you see. She drew beautifully. They all did. When you see their drawings of what they find, they are very talented. But she was super supportive and would lend her these copies of articles and drawings for Mary's education. So that helped her master the science. So on these belemnites that she's getting the ink from, what are they? They're in the category of something that you'd find on the beach there, but usually not in that form. They were nicknamed devil's fingers. And you most likely find the bullet shape. Belemnon is Greek for dart, and that's about true. You're likely, if you do find one, going to find a piece of that dart shape that can be pointy. I have a piece of it. It's so tiny. It's just a very incomplete piece of the dart. So they call it a rostrum. It's bullet shaped. That's usually what you get, but you don't so usually get the soft tissue, including the beak or the ink sac or the arm hooks. And in the case of the ink, they were using the ink sac. So scientists were actually able to use oxygen isotope ratios from these to figure out that they were living in warm temperature water. They actually think that at the time, that Jurassic coast where they were living was on the same latitude as the Mediterranean, much farther south. Well, she had people that were in her corner, thankfully, because she relied on them in her lifetime. Mary had a very good customer named Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Birch. And he was a fossil collector, and that's it. He didn't actually go out and find them. He just wanted to buy them. And he's a longstanding customer. He bought a complete ichthyosaurus from her in 1818. So Lieutenant Colonel Birch purchased it. Birch credited in writing later, never marry. It wasn't his fault, but he found in 1819 when he returned to Lyme Regis that her family, she was supporting her widowed mother too. They're about ready to sell their furniture because they can't make rent. So in a very benevolent act, he decides to auction all of the specimens that he's ever bought from her. And he organizes an auction in London, and it attracts international attention. It raised, in today's money, about 36,000 pounds, dollars. But some portion of that went to the Annings, and some remarkable things got auctioned in that. That ichthyosaur that was complete went to the Royal College of Surgeons for 100 pounds. That's no small money in those days, but that was destroyed in World War II. Some of her specimens absolutely exist in British museums. Some are in Europe, but then again, some are unaccounted for and presumed lost, as in this case. Somebody else in her corner was a man named William Buckland. He's an academic. His dates, 1784, make him about, 15 years older than Mary. He's an eccentric geologist and paleontologist and minister. So his worlds are colliding for sure. He was the first professor of geology at Oxford, and he was very entertaining. In fact, he was known for wearing his academic robes, his big garb out when he went fossil hunting, kind of odd. And he would impersonate dinosaurs walking for his lectures, also memorable. There's a quote from Lewis Carroll, who wrote The Alice in Wonderland. "You're entirely bonkers, but I'll tell you a secret. All the best people are." He's a good guy because he actually credits Mary in her lifetime, one of the very few. He actually described Megalosaurus and came up with that name, which means big dinosaur. He had a hobby. This is more in the eccentric category. He liked to eat exotic meats, including hedgehog, mouse on toast, crocodile, and then reportedly he had tasted the heart preserved in alcohol of King Louis XIV of France. Ugh. Well, what a guy. He was fascinated with a type of fossil called coprolites. What is it? Fossilized poo. There it is. Victorian women would find these and make them into jewelry and wear them, not really grasping what were they. But that he is credited with as a big scholar in that field, and Mary helped him find a lot of the samples as well. He had a table made of it, and it sits in the Lyme Regis Museum, actually. Those inlays are coprolites, and so I will show you. It happened to have a coprolite. This was from our trip. So one of the hallmarks of them is that they're very irregularly shaped. You can see all the pock marks in them. They are also irregular in color. They've got brown in this one and dark gray and light gray, but a really telling sign, and hopefully you can see it a little bit. If I tip it, it's very shiny in the gray part. In certain lights, it will reflect light. Ooh, I had it there. Well, if you had this live in your hand, sometimes you could get it to glimmer. Those are fossilized fish scales. So someone was eating fish. Ew. But it's really instructive in paleontology, because then you're able to study the diet of whatever the dinosaurs were on the scene at the time. So scientifically speaking, highly important. There was a new creature about ready to be discovered. The highlights in 1820 and 21. So she'd be about 21, 22 years old. She found a partial skeleton of a marine reptile they'd never seen before. And it was later named plesiosaur. Academic authors go ahead and thank the man that bought the fossil from Mary. Here we go again. And then in 1823 and 4, she finds a complete plesiosaur. So these are the gold standards, complete fossils. So she reports it to William Buckland. Now she's starting to get into a network that can be helpful, the right people, the academics of this field. And he arranges a private sale, thankfully, so he can connect her up to the right museums. But a wrinkle. Mary drew it in very beautiful detail, as you can see there. It was examined by Georges Cuvier, and he deemed it to be fake. He said that Mary didn't know what she was looking at and that she had cobbled together pieces of different species. And that prompted an emergency meeting of the Geological Society. And they ruled it real, that Cuvier was wrong on that. The reason he was so taken aback is that it has such a long neck. And he had just never seen anything like it before. And he didn't think it was anatomically plausible that anything would have this long neck. They reckon that this is like Nessie, the Loch Ness Monster, would have looked if such things exist. But thankfully, they ruled in her favor, because had they not, her fossil business would have gone kaput. Any credibility she had for what is she looking at would have gone out the window. In 1826, she bought a home with a storefront, and she named it Anning's Fossil Depot. And this is how she made her living. They found one of these actually in the city I lived in England in 2014 in a clay quarry. So they are yet to be found, but quite fascinating. So moving on in time, another huge discovery in 1828, she discovers the first pterosaur that's been found on British soil. Talk about needing 3D recognition skills. This is a jumble of wings that you can imagine has to be in your mind unfurled to realize this is almost a bird. So the international scientific community had never seen one of these outside Germany before. So they were very excited about it. They had wings. They were the largest flying animals ever. And what you see in the picture in the frame, she prepared and made the frame. And it sits still in the Natural History Museum in London. So kids sometimes learn this by the name of pterodactyl. But more scientifically speaking, it's pterosaur. And that's a rendering in the picture of what scientists think it could have looked like. So another good guy in her corner was named Henry de la Beche, and he's a contemporary and similar in age. He's only 3 years older, 1796 in his case. He's her childhood friend. He's loaded. And the reason is he'd moved to Lyme as a child after returning from his family's Jamaican slave plantations. They grew sugarcane. So he inherited these at 21, and this he's made. He has an income for life. And coincidentally, the British slave trade, they ended in 1807, but it wasn't abolished officially until 1833, because a lot of the colonies relied on slave labor to continue making the products they were exporting. But he was inspired by Mary's love of geology growing up, and this is what he decided he wanted to do. So he joined the Geological Society at 21. Again, they wouldn't let Mary in because they just didn't, not until 1919. He authored a paper, he was a co-author, about the anatomy of Mary's ichthyosaur and plesiosaur finds and presented it on her behalf, but he credits her. There is some speculation, and it particularly comes up in, let's see, I think some of the remarkable creatures might riff on this a bit. Did she ever have a romance? Well, no, we don't know. We just don't know. The only little telltale evidence that does exist is from a lady named Anna Marie Pinney. She was a young friend, and she would go fossil with Mary on the beaches, and she would write down her impressions of the conversation she and Mary had. So once in her diary, she mentions that Mary said she'd been suffering from an emotional illness for a length of time that coincides with her friend Henry de la Beche's getting separated from his wife. So do we know? Not really. Is that enough to go on? So this sketch sometimes is credited as Mary, but people anymore think that actually it's William Buckland, wearing his academic garb, as he did, in a totally different part of the country called Snowdonia up in Wales. And he wore a top hat to go fossiling with his fossil hammer, largely because they were kind of like doubling as a safety helmet and rain barrier. It rains there a lot. So Henry de la Beche did her and her family a lovely service. He watercolored this famous picture called Duria antiquior, and it involves all of the species that Mary found. And he had lithographs of this printed, and he sold them, and he donated all the proceeds to Mary because goodness knows she needed it. But it's really detailed. You can see that the plesiosaur is being chomped. And there's coprolites actually falling out of him. Yikes. But it was successful, at least that she got some revenue out of that. In late 1830, she makes a big find, a new plesiosaur entirely. She writes William Buckland about it. Good move, Mary. He's in your corner. He's super interested because not only is it so rare to find this intact, but it's got coprolites in its pelvis still. So he's all sorts of intrigued. Usually those remains get dispersed. So it's named Plesiosaurus macrocephalus, that is big head, by Buckland. However, a few other players on the scene at the time, Sir Richard Owen in particular, he wrote about it in 1840. He was the guy that coined the term dinosaur, so he has some cred in the field. But he thanked the wealthy gentleman who brought it to him, here we go again, and made it available for his inspection. Mary never gets a mention, despite the fact that she found it, she excavated it, and she prepared it. So here is a little bit of peril, though. In 1833, she had a very near miss, and it was a sad time because she lost Trey. He was killed in a rock slide. She was out fossiling. That was her fossiling companion. So this is just but one example of how perilous it was to try to do what she was doing. And she wrote about it to a friend of hers named Charlotte Murchison, that it was but a moment between me and the same fate. And so she took her life in her hands literally every time she went out there to look. She just never knew what would happen, even with so many years of experience. Well, speaking of experience, academics get wind of her, and a few of them on the scene. In 1834, a man named Louis Agassiz, who was Swiss, he originated the theory of the Ice Age, and he was a big fossil fish enthusiast. He's a good guy. And the reason is he came to visit Mary and Elizabeth Philpott. She would correspond with him. And he named fossil fish after those two in their lifetime. They get credit for something, finally. Then in 1839, Richard Owen, remember the guy that didn't credit her, he comes to pick her brains, basically, and he is in true amateur form caught out because he didn't know the tide schedule. And he got cut off by the incoming tide. He survived, but he had to clamber up cliffs, which could have killed him alone. But perhaps the most glittery guest was in 1844. The King of Saxony, King Frederick Augustus II, came to visit, and he brought a surgeon, as you did. He collected fossils, and the surgeon asked for her to please write down her name and address for future. And she did, and she wrote underneath it, they still have this, I am well known throughout the whole of Europe. So people had come in calling, and she was developing this reputation. However, this from the Anna Maria Pinney diaries was what she thought of what was happening to Mary. The world has used her ill. These men of learning have sucked her brains and made a great deal by publishing works of which she furnished the contents, while she derived none of the advantages. True. She has hard times again. 1836, she sent her entire life savings of 200 pounds off to a person, a man that was supposed to invest it for her. No receipts, he dies. That's gone, just evaporated. So friends of hers in the Geological Society petitioned the Prime Minister on her behalf to please grant her enough to live, eke by the rest of her life, $4,000 a year in a little pension, and she got it. But it made the paper that this had happened to her. The average worker's income is about 25 pounds a year at this point, so she lost 8 years' income in one go. Up until she died, 1847, she would collect that pension. The last 2 years of her life, she was sick with breast cancer. People in the town thought that she was kind of loopy and just out in space. Well, yes, she was. She was on laudanum, opium. And that breast cancer in her time was a death sentence. In fact, it was rare that the patient would be informed. They would tell remaining family what was happening, but they didn't want to upset the patient, so they would withhold that information. Interestingly enough, though, she was buried in a Church of England churchyard. So at some point in her later life, she converted from being a dissenter. And it was her Joseph, her brother's widow, Amelia, who had her grave marker erected, which you can see. But just when you think things might improve as time passes from 1847 on, the Lyme historian in 1930 named Cyril Wanklyn, what a name, describes her as thus: it is difficult for us to understand Mary Anning's widespread reputation nowadays. She was in fact not a scientist at all. only the handmaiden of scientific men, and she became associated with many of great distinction. Well, gee, thanks, huh? Because did she have the opportunity to actually do for herself? No, the deck was completely stacked against her. By virtue of her being female, she couldn't have ascended any higher, certainly not with her status. She never married. All sorts of things went bad for her. So considering though what was against her, she just was triumphant, frankly, and especially in her death. So the Geological Society of London that wouldn't admit her in her lifetime. They memorialized her. They're the first woman that they did that for. And then in 2010, the Royal Society of Scientists included Anning amongst the 10 most influential women in British science history. There's a little tongue twister that sometimes is rumored to be about her. She sells seashells on a seashore, and I can say that, but barely. Is it about her? Well, a Librarian of Congress says, unfortunately not, that they cannot link up the dates that this was made popular with her time. This is a pastel. This is based on the oil drawing or oil painting that you saw in the first slide. And the historian wrote, it's often said the moon is made of cheese, but our colleagues at NASA are not planning a huge fondue party. So in other words, no proof. It's nice, but perhaps it served its purpose as an inspiration to get her name out there. But no, there's really not a lot of proof that's actually about her. She's come up lately. Not too far long ago, 2014, a metal detectorist on the beach, not very far out of the Lyme Regis Museum, found this little medallion. It's metal, impressed with the words Mary Anning, 1810, and on the back it says Lyme Regis, age 11. And it's they reckon that it was made by her dad for her on the occasion of her 11th birthday. However, she lost it, and it was at least found, but hundreds of years later, and he went on and died later that year. So the Harvard paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould has said that Mary Anning was probably the most important unsung or inadequately sung collecting force in the history of paleontology. She's had 40 books written about her. A lot of them are for children, but more are being written for an adult audience with more serious history, more pithy history in them. Lots of work, several for the stage in plays, and she's been in 3 films, not personally, but her life has. The most probably prominent of which was in 2020 with Kate Winslet. Kate Winslet, called Ammonite. Then later this spring, hopefully something nice will happen for her again. A little girl about 4 years ago named Evie Swire. She was 13 at the time. She thought that Mary needed her own statue in bronze outside the museum because so many prominent British citizens had a bronze, and she was certainly valuable and prominent, and she did not. So she crowdfunded the money, more than £100,000, and had a sculptor commissioned to make it. And they hope to have it up for Mary Anning's birthday in May. And lately, in 2020, one of her very rare letters came up at auction at Sotheby's, 190 years after it was written, to William Buckland. Go figure, they're talking about coprolites. And the Lyme Regis Museum desperately wanted it, and they crowdfunded about £40,000. The auction estimate was thinking it'd go for between 8 and 10. It was sold to a private collector for £100,800. Ouch. They couldn't possibly have bought it. So it's anonymous. We don't know who owns this now. If you've enjoyed the topic and you'd like to know a little more, I can point you in a few directions. Patty Howe, who is a geologist at Lyme Regis Museum, he has a YouTube video giving you a virtual beach tour, a fossil walk like we took. And it's really interesting. And it says a lot of the things about what to watch out for, what you bring, what you're looking for. As I had mentioned earlier, there was a fictional novel, novels are fiction, about 10 years-ish ago by Tracy Chevalier, a bestseller called Remarkable Creatures, inspired by her life. There was The French Lieutenant's Woman, John Fowles. That's been a few years back in the 60s, but then the film made in the 80s. Ammonite, the film, depressing, evocative, extremely, a lot of ambiance for how bleak it is in the English winter and how crushing her poverty was. So educational in that way. Takes license with unproven facts of her life. And The Fossil Hunter is a good nonfiction book by a journalist named Shelley Emling. However, my favorite is The Fossil Woman by a geologist named Tom Sharp. That's come out in the last year or so. And that's really an interesting book based largely on what historical evidence exists. So we are at the end. I always tell people if they would like to think of, or if they think of a question that not at the time, and they can find me, they can do so reasonably easily, hopefully. If you can remember my name spelled Claire, I have a website called Tea with Claire. And you can email me from there. If you're on Facebook, you can find me under the same name. And I post little bits of interest about my talks, just things that intrigue me, hopefully you too. And with that, I will come back to you and I might see if there's any questions.
If anybody has any questions, please feel free to add them to the chat right now or let us know.
Shall I tell them about that fun little raising hand feature? Because I noticed at least, I think one person at least is on an iPad. I've discovered this lately. If you happen to be using an iPad, Android, if you're on the Zoom app, usually phones have it too. Sometimes if at least it did on my iPad, if you merely raise your hand, we were talking earlier about I speak with my hands and that probably happened like this or something. If you raise your hand, Zoom recognizes you have raised your hand. I have a question, and then we can unmute you. So that's kind of funky. I've never actually used it in practice. It's like the urban legend of this is how Zoom works, but it's yet unproven in my personal experience. So if you feel bold, if you'd like to give it a go, I think we'd all benefit from the experiment. How's that?
Absolutely.
Yes. I'm trying to think. Oh, someone's done it. Hurrah. Carol raised her hand. Can you help out perhaps?
Can do.
I just did this for you. I really don't have a question.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I Zoom with my Weight Watchers group all the time and we raise our hand all the time.
Yeah. So it works. Eureka.
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Especially when you have a huge group, you know. But I just enjoy listening to you. You're so delightful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I do feel like I have turned the best of my old life. That's for sure. Am I an opportunist? Perhaps, but I'm just happy that people find this stuff interesting. I certainly do too. So I do. Yeah, I know.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. And thank you for being my guinea pig. I really appreciate that. We're due finally to go back to the UK. We have been absent too long from COVID in late May and June, and I have some scouting for future talks on my location list. I'm going to do one on Roman ruins and buried artifacts, Viking hordes, all sorts, so I need to see some. And then the All Creatures Great and Small. I need to tour Yorkshire a bit more. I've been there, but not in sincerity, and I'm quite addicted to the PBS remake of it, so hopefully those things come to pass. But yes, as those are trips I'd like to have. I've had this trip already, so Lyme Regis is a fabulous location if you need a little seaside resort with some really interesting history in it. And Kathy said thank you, we really enjoyed this, and I thank you back for coming. Let us see, anything else?
Well, if there's no other questions, Claire, thank you so much for coming and talking to us tonight. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And I hope
my pleasure as always. So thanks again for your time. And I look forward, I hope we can carry on virtual talking because boy, it's fun to do it from my house. I got to tell you.
Absolutely. All right. You all have a great rest of your night. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Good night.